Welcome back to the webinar series, Healthier Business. This is Healthier Business, protecting the physical and financial health of businesses with the new normal of COVID-19, right? It's a webinar sponsored by PhD Retirement Consulting and the Better Business Bureau of Greater Kansas City. Not just because, we don't want just better businesses, but we'd like to see healthier businesses. So in part one of our series, we were joined by Dr. Ryan Jacobson. He's the medical director of Johnson County. In part two of our series, we were joined by Marvin Carolina. Marvin Carolina would be actually the leader of the Better Business Bureau, and he talked about the economic impact of COVID-19. And then, of course, we've been joined throughout the series by Mercedes Gibbons. He of the YouTube fame, Minute with Mercedes. You'll find his channel, popular YouTube channel on YouTube. And then, of course, I'm Troy Redstone. I'm the founder and engineer behind PhD Retirement Consulting. So in this third part of our series, we're going to be joined again by Dr. Ryan Jacobson. And he is, of course, the medical director, as I mentioned, for Johnson County, Kansas. Now, this is for the a part of the greater Kansas City metropolitan area. We do thank you for sending in questions. Some have emailed, called, and such. And we thank you, Dr. Ryan, for making time today to answer a few questions. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Troy.
Absolutely. I know you're super busy. I mentioned that we broke today's content into 3 different sessions. The third session is going to be something that is really trending right now all across the United States. Social media, everyone's kind of saying, when can we get back to work? We're going to get to that. The second session is just how to protect ourselves during all of this. And then the first session that we want to start out with is just kind of an overview of how things are. So, you're in a unique role. Those of you who don't know, I know you and I visited about this many times. You're the medical director for the county, but you also just stay fresh, if we want to use that kind of term, sharp, by actually getting in ER and actually working at the different ERs around the city. And so you have a unique view of both administration as well as practitioner. Thank you so much for your work on the front lines. I can't imagine the workload you're under over the last several weeks. So thank you for your work. Can you tell us a little bit more about the latest expectations of when we're expecting this to peak? What are the latest projections? What can we be expecting here in the middle of the country?
Yeah, it's a great question. Very difficult to answer because, as you know, models are based on a lot of assumptions, and depending on the type of assumptions that you put into a model, impact the results of that model. So fortunately, we continue to get more and more data. And in the Kansas City area, depending on the model that you look at, most people feel that instead of seeing a very large surge or a spike, it looks like we're hopefully, very cautiously optimistic that we'll have a continued rise and more of a smolder, which allows for our hospitals to maintain capacity without having some sort of cataclysmic sudden surge or spike. Presuming the stay-at-home orders and social and physical distancing that we've been doing are continued for some period of time going forward. So most are saying, some of the local modelers, depending on the region and the state, are saying in the next couple of weeks is when we anticipate kind of a little bit of a rise. However, we're hopeful and cautiously optimistic that we do not have any sort of exponential type growth. We're seeing continued increase in cases, but it's a manageable pace for the healthcare system overall in the region, which is good news.
It's great news. I haven't heard the technical term of smoldering yet. That's a good one. So we're not just flattening the curve here. We're burning it up, right?
Right.
At one point, you told me something about a peak like April 23rd or April 24th. So that's even really changed. It's not like we're expecting it to continue to get worse and worse until this particular peak. And like April 24th or something like that is what you're saying. There's not a peak that we're looking at per se.
So a couple of weeks ago, that was the best data that we had coming out of the University of Washington. And that since they've had a number of revisions to their data, and our data here locally in Kansas and the Kansas City region looks much more favorable as far as what we're seeing compared to our sister cities in New York or New Orleans or the West Coast. This is good news, and there can certainly be no date applied to it any longer. I do think that they're looking at broader ranges, and over the next couple weeks, we're hopeful again there is no large increase in cases, and it does not overwhelm hospital capacity. So overall, the projections, I think, for the Kansas City region are cautiously optimistic right now, presuming that we continue to do good hand hygiene, physical distancing, and things of that nature.
That's really encouraging. I know when I first heard the peak, of course, my mind, like probably a lot of people, went to this whole idea of, what's happening in New York City. And I thought, I can't imagine what they're dealing with in New York City is what we're going to look like in 2 weeks. And is it simply because it's less densely populated here? Is that why we're not seeing that peak that you were referring to?
I think there's a number of issues. One, Kansas and Missouri enacted some fairly robust stay-at-home orders earlier before we had seen a large number of cases. That was involving school closures, the non-essential business closures, essential business only stay-at-home orders. Those were done earlier in comparison to some of those larger cities that started seeing cases, and then trying to enact those changes later. They got a little bit behind the 8 ball, and we've had the benefit of seeing their experience, talking with those policymakers, those healthcare leaders in those communities, and learning from what they have seen. So the Midwest, at least in the Kansas City region, has been protected somewhat from those types of hyper-dense population that you see in New York or New Orleans or Chicago or Detroit. We have a benefit of a little bit more of a suburban, a less densely populated area, as well as enacting those measures early allowed us to stay ahead of the curve a little bit and mitigate the sudden cataclysmic rise or a sudden really big rise. So we have seen success with what we're doing, and I think it's really helped to flatten that curve and keep our hospital capacity and healthcare system from being overrun.
Oh, that's super encouraging. You're putting a smile on a lot of people's faces today. My theory, if there is a theory, and I'm obviously not a medical professional, but my theory has been that all of this encouragement to quarantine and to take these 2 weeks, my theory is that if everyone were to take the same 2 weeks, it would make a tremendous difference. But obviously the social distancing is working, and obviously the quarantine is working. Those in this area of the country are used to tornadoes. I grew up in South Florida where we had hurricanes, and you could see the storm coming for a long time. And I think here, we have an opportunity to say, just look at the news of what's happening in New York City. That may have gotten some people's attention. Maybe, people were taking more like, 2 weeks at home can bring shalom. I heard people saying that during this most recent Easter weekend. And just, the idea that, 2 weeks in the house, it's no time to grouse. And then this is a kind of an encouraging one. It's only a fortnight. This isn't a game. That's for the kids at home, but maybe it's also for the dads. That's a great dad joke, right? But it sounds like the social distancing is actually working. Like people simply staying at home. And I'm sure that's your encouragement, is just hang on for a couple more weeks. This is really working. And you're not saying just not seeing a huge spike, but actually a smoldering. That's what I'm hearing. That's really encouraging.
Correct.
So, well, we're going to wrap up this session, and we're going to come back with more questions about how to keep yourself safe after the break. You can follow all of these sessions, the entire webinar series, on YouTube. Send your questions through us on the toll-free number, or reach out via troy@phdfirm.com. Great time to be following us on the socials as well. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll pick you up after the break.